One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. In your view, who profits from the single nmfishbowl.com site? The taxpayers?
Yeah, I think it's a benefit to the university, though I'm sure that there's many people at the university who feel the opposite of that. I think it's certainly a benefit. I think it's a benefit to the taxpayers. I think it's a benefit to other journalists. I mean, I'm now the recipient of emails from other reporters or editors at newspapers who are sort of looking at what I've done and trying to model that in their specific beat. So yeah, I think there, I think this is going to sound a little bit high-handed, but yeah, I mean, there's a societal benefit to somebody trying to look more critically and ethically at college sports, even in like this tiny little petri dish that I'm doing it with New Mexico.
Yeah, I think many people in college athletics recognize the role of the media as a watchdog. Some of the feedback I've heard on your efforts have ranged from, come on, some of this stuff isn't that big of a deal, to, as you might imagine, holy cow. Okay, so if we're getting outside of what you call this petri dish, is there a model that can be built at scale that is a true profit-generating business for you and or for a team of investigative journalists of your same ilk?
I don't know. I don't necessarily think there is, but I will say this: we find ourselves at a time where the newspaper industry over the last 15 years has been ravaged, and this is all well known. Staffs have been cut. There's now a number of unemployed journalists who were employed once before. But in spite of all of this, the United States is still employing quite a few college sports reporters across the country, and at newspapers across the country, and these reporters are sort of caught, to use a football cliche, in no man's land. They're not able to keep up with the scooplets and recruiting news that is now gushing out of fan sites and Twitter and pay sites. So they've sort of relinquished that as a opportunity, and at the same time, they're still kind of constrained by and oriented towards serving that kind of college sports fan. So I actually think that if newspaper college sports reporters sort of and their editors thereof reflected on what their purpose was, what are they actually accomplishing these days? They have these positions staffed. They're not particularly relevant on the real interesting stuff to the college sports fans. They could actually do the kind of journalism that I'm doing and justify it in a way that I don't think that they can really justify on any level, financially, journalistically, the kinds of coverage that they're more often producing than not, which is the sorts of coverage that is produced when you report on the midweek press conference, the lead-in before the game, and the post-game coverage. It's not interesting entertainment-wise. It's not useful journalistically, and for newspapers that have slashed their staffs on a whole bunch of fronts, at some point, I think this is the only justification that they have to continue to maintain these beats. So along that line, there are people at for-profit newspapers that I think are actually well-positioned to do this around the country. Whether or not there's a national version of the website that I'm doing, I don't know. I think definitely some of my traffic has, been encouraging that even if college sports fans, or in my case, Lobo sports fans, don't like what I'm doing, if the subject is about the team that they care about, they'll read it even if the news is somewhat critical or cynical or negative. So I definitely think there's an audience out there. I don't know if there's actually a for-profit model for doing this. I'm suspicious, and that really wasn't why I'm doing this. This is more of a kind of hobby, a journalistic exercise I'm doing more than it is I'm envisioning a business. I'm not envisioning a business for this.
Then how far do you continue to pursue what's happening in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico?
That's a good question. Not forever. I mean, at some point, I think I've made my point. I've done what I think is some good with this. And it's time for me to move on and write about something else. And whether or not that something else is to continue to cover college sports, I'm interested in exploring that. I'm interested in a job or a position or an opportunity to write about this more nationally. But I'm also open to the possibility that this will just be one strange year of my journalism career, where in 2016 to 17, I spent a lot of time writing about UNM.
What's the volume of feedback you get on one of the pieces you've done? Are we talking dozens of emails, hundreds of emails?
It sort of depends, and this is an interesting week to talk to you. So about a week and a half ago, I published a 20,000-word story that I spent 3 months interviewing over 50 sources for, that looked about the kind of political influences at the University of New Mexico. A lot of what I wrote about was how that sort of swirled around the athletics department as well. And it was a fairly well-trafficked story for my site. It was probably the second most traffic I got on that of any piece I've published. Then this week, or earlier this week, we're talking now on a Sunday, I suppose. So this past week, I broke the news that Bob Davie was under investigation by the university, that it had hired an outside counsel to investigate now Lobo football coach Bob Davie. And that story got linked on ESPN and Yahoo and Sports Illustrated and ABC.com. And so my traffic was a total outlier. And obviously, the tweets and emails I got from that were sort of unusually high. So because I write so infrequently, and because some of the stuff I'm writing really only has an Albuquerque or New Mexico audience, I don't. There's not a ton of response. I get response from the people who I would think actually most care about that. Whereas some of the stories I've written, I wrote a long critical profile of former Lobo basketball coach Craig Neal that got a little bit of national attention, and certainly this Bob Davie thing got some decent national links and viral play. So I got a lot more there. So it's a long way of answering. Sort of depends on the piece that I've just posted.
So I think to bring this somewhat full circle to D1 Ticker and one question, I have to ask what Eddie Nunez needs to do early in his tenure as the new New Mexico athletic director.
Be honest about where he is. I mean, so Eddie Nunez just spent a bunch of time at LSU. It really seems he was reared in the SEC. New Mexico is not LSU, and if he's a guy who wants to come in and build a lot of infrastructure and boost his resume so that he can ultimately land an even more high-profile athletics director job, that might benefit him, but that'll be detrimental to New Mexico. I mean, this is the problem of a place. This might be a problem of college athletics in general. This is certainly a problem for a place like New Mexico, is that there's adverse incentives for the administrators who come in and take this job. They want to reflect particularly infrastructure development. This was the case with his predecessor, Paul Krebs, who oversaw the remodel of the pit and the improvements to the baseball stadium and the football stadium. And so there's been a lot of building, and the university has incurred quite a bit of debt that it can't afford now. And this is the problem when you have somebody who's sort of an outsider looking at UNM as a stepping stone, which, let's be frank, most people would. Or most people would aspire to. So, it was a strange hire to me. Not knowing anything about Eddie Nunez other than where he came from, it seemed to be the kind of hire that showed very little introspection from the University of New Mexico. Here is a school that is trying to climb out of a deep debt, that's having a whole bunch of financial mismanagement problems based on overspending of the last decade, and they've just hired somebody who came from college athletics royalty, who never had to worry about these sorts of issues at LSU. If anything, the issue he had to worry about was how do we spend all this money we have. So that to me is a huge change and a strange hire to make for that kind of need, but that's the job before him if New Mexico is not going to be benighted by the same problems it's had over the last 10 years.
And that's today's One Question, brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. One Question is designed to give D1 Ticker subscribers valuable insights on how executive leaders in college athletics think about key issues on their respective campuses, in their departments, or within their leagues and conferences. One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996.